With everything going on in the world, Joe Biden wants to do gun control with crime exploding? Come on now. My name is Bryan Preston. Welcome to Come On Now. You've probably heard of this guy, Robert Francis Beto O'Rourke, the fake Latinx from Texas, who during the presidential campaign, which by the way he lost badly, said this.
Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. We're not going to allow it to be used against our fellow Americans anymore.
As I pointed out in the previous segment, Beto O'Rourke did not win the presidential nomination. He didn't even get to lap 2 or 3. He didn't do very well. But as a sop to the far left, Joe Biden said he was going to turn Beto O'Rourke into his gun guy. But he hasn't done that yet. He's probably going to at some point, and he's getting a lot of pressure from the left to do that. Now, gun control doesn't make any sense in the current context whatsoever. We are actually experiencing a crime wave in this country. Not only are we experiencing a crime wave in this country, meaning violent crime, homicides, assaults, and the like are going up, police response times are also going up. There was a study that came out this past week that showed that in the wake of defunding the police, surprise, surprise, police are actually taking longer to get to people who call for them. There's a saying when it comes to police work that when seconds count, police are minutes away. That's not a knock on the police. It's just a statement of fact. And now they're more minutes away than they ever have been, at least for the last 20 or so years, because cities run by Democrats defunded police. There's really no good reason to be, as far as crime goes, to be going after guns at this point. In fact, Americans are subjected to more violent crime than they were 20 years ago. And they need to be able to defend themselves. They also need to be able to send criminals the message that they will be defending themselves so that criminals don't invade their homes and assault them and kill them. Now, an interesting thing about gun control, it doesn't generally track with crime in history. In fact, if you've watched the Netflix show Age of Samurai, please pay attention to the 4th episode. There's a very interesting moment that I'll get to in a second. First, here is the trailer for Netflix's Age of Samurai.
1551. Japan is in chaos. Anarchy reigns as heavily armed warlords fight for power and territory.
In the Sengoku period, there were no more rules. This was all-out battle for control of Japan. You have the men who are going to shape the destiny of Japan coming together. Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Masamune, and Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Samurai combat is more brutal than anyone can imagine. These assassins, spies, and agents were not to be trifled with.
These are the greatest warriors history's ever known.
The wheels were now set in motion for the most decisive struggle for power in the whole of Japanese history. The real battle for Japan was about to begin.
One thing you should notice in seeing the trailer for Age of Samurai is the samurai armor itself. We hear a lot these days about, cultural appropriation, stealing one's culture to somehow use it for your own ends. Well, actually, George Lucas stole quite a bit from this period of Japanese history. Take a look at the samurai armor in Age of Samurai, and then take a look at this armor on Darth Vader. Looks pretty familiar, doesn't it? Darth Vader is actually a fallen samurai in the way of Age of Samurai, or from that historic period. But of course, in Star Wars, he's the great villain who has the great turn. Clearly, George Lucas borrowed or culturally appropriated the Sengoku Jidai. But on the other hand, Akira Kurosawa, who's probably the greatest Japanese filmmaker in history, appropriated things going the other way. He actually used the Sengoku Jidai as a backdrop to do a film called Ran back in the 1980s, or Ran, however you want to pronounce it. which is actually a take on King Lear. King Lear is, of course, Shakespeare, Western literary history, greatest writer we've ever had. So this whole idea of cultural appropriation, I think, is insane. It's really cultural pollination. It's borrowing great ideas from one culture to use them in another and to go back and forth and back and forth. So you have George Lucas, one of the most successful filmmakers in Western history, and Akira Kurosawa essentially borrowing from the traditions of each other to create better things. There was a time when we actually encouraged that, when we had open minds in this society, which we don't have anymore. In fact, folks might even today accuse George Lucas of cultural appropriation and want to end Star Wars. I have my own problems with Star Wars, mainly how Disney is managing it, but not having anything to do with cultural appropriation. Getting back to our main storyline, the Sengoku Jidai was a period of chaos in Japanese history. Nobody really ruled everything. All power was in the hands of these local feudal warlords called daimyo. And the daimyo exacted a pretty, what you might say, a full hand or a strong hand of a role wherever they ruled. If you crossed them, you probably had your head separated from your shoulders. This was a very violent period in Japanese history. After that period ends, the first person to really consolidate power is a man by the name of Hideyoshi Toyotomi. And Toyotomi was not high-born. He was actually not born in the high samurai classes, but he took power anyway because he was really ruthless and willing to kill everyone who got in his way. It's interesting in Age of Samurai to see how the historians cover the sword hunt. It doesn't get a lot of screen time in the series, and when the historians do talk about it, they're clearly talking about it from the context of modern gun control, because they talk about how it brought peace to Japan. It didn't really do that if you were a minority of any kind in Japan. In particular, in that period, there was a minority of Christians who were mainly in the southern part of the country. And the sword hunt happens in about 1590, and by 1614, Hideyoshi and his government have banned Christianity altogether because they see it as a threat. And then in the years going forward from there, they enforce the weapon control, the sword hunt, the gun control, and they persecute Christians to the point of killing about 300,000 of them. That was actually made a whole lot easier by the sword hunt of the 1590s because the Christians couldn't defend themselves. It was as simple as that. It's a very interesting series, and I think when we look back at history, what we see oftentimes is once someone has taken power, they use whatever they can to consolidate that power, whether that's actually good for the people they rule or not. In this case, right now that we're dealing with, crime is exploding. Democrats who control cities, Seattle, Portland, New York, Chicago, LA, the big cities, they defunded the police. That made police times response go higher, that made crime go higher, and that made all of us at greater risk than we have been probably in our adult lives in dealing with directly violent crime. This is not a good time to be going for gun control, but Biden and Beto and his group want to do it. You should be asking yourselves now, why? What is the point? Why do they want to go on this gun hunt? Is it really about keeping all of us safe? Come on now. My name is Bryan Preston.